Welcome to Teaching Truth. Dick and I were already seated as Greg came through the door. He was his usual jovial self. His inquiring eyes flashed back and forth from Dick to me. "What's up?" he asked. At that moment, I desperately wanted to trade my call to the ministry for any other profession. I wanted to be on any other planet but this one. I wished for someone else to assume my role as senior pastor. And then I wanted to fade into the woodwork and disappear. Oh, how I wanted to avoid the inevitable, but I could not. "Greg," I said, "we've just had some very disturbing news. Dick and I have been on the phone all morning listening to acquaintances of yours describe you in a way that we have not known you. Two men have been telling us that you have been immoral with their wives. We have talked to the women and they have confirmed the story. A pastor from the same community called and said that the word is out and the stories are reaching scandalous proportions. Is any of this true?" I watched him as the colour drained from his face. His eyes lowered and his shoulders sagged. I saw telltale beads of perspiration pop out across his forehead. He heaved one long, agonizing sigh, shook his head, and said, "Yes, Pastor, it's true." A true story that's captured in the book Beyond Forgiveness, The Healing Touch of Church Discipline by Pastor Don Baker. In the early chapters, it tells of Greg's seduction, of how a serpent had slipped into and slithered into his life and had almost destroyed his ministry and his marriage. Another serpent had slithered into the church at Pergamum, the Nicolaitans. It was Irenaeus, a 2nd century church leader, who wrote that the Nicolaitans, quote, led lives of unrestrained indulgence as a right of Christian liberty. Clement of Alexandria, they had great names in those days, didn't they? Clement of Alexandria, another 2nd century church leader, in writing about the Nicolaitans, said this, quote, "They abandoned themselves to pleasure like goats, living a life of self-indulgence." And so those following the doctrine and the practices of the Nicolaitans felt free to participate in worship of the emperor and other pagan gods, and lived according to the cultural standards of greed, of social position and power, rather than to godly standards. Give Satan a foothold and he will inhabit it, was the reality in the church at Pergamum. You see, Satan had found the chink in their armour and had lured those, a bit like Greg, a bit like Charles Shine, had lured those who were once faithful to abandon their good confession, and that is no less true today. Power tempts and people fall. Sex, money, and power today are the three greatest temptations which can cause someone to abandon the faith. Sex, money, and power. The three greatest temptations which can cause someone to abandon the faith. The three snakes, as it were, that can slither into even our lives. You see, the world is a tyrant of a lover, an abusive lover, a so-called lover who lures and brings you to a point where you abandon your values, your morals. And unless you stand strong in Jesus Christ, even your faith in Jesus Christ, and Jesus warns against such a lover. Because Jesus Christ is the bridegroom whose love is consistent and everlasting. And we are his bride who he will never abandon. And although these destructive forces can be found within the body of believers, the church, we can apply it individually too. And I say this to myself before I say it to anyone who is listening to this today. We should always begin by looking at ourselves, to put our own house in order, to take, as Jesus said, the speck out of our own eye first, before taking the log, as it were, out of the eye of others. You see, Christ in Revelation 2:16, in this letter to the church at Pergamum, gives the command to repent in relation to the doctrine of Balaam and the Nicolaitans. The church had abandoned, that's what we're focusing on today, had abandoned their commitment to Christ. It was a serious warning to stop abandoning, because if they didn't repent, then there would be consequences. And the warning is no less stark for us today. When I was a small boy, I remember a bully at school saying to me, "I know where you live, Cartwright. I know where you live, Cartwright." It was terrifying. But here where Jesus is speaking, it's not terrifying when he says, "I know where you live." It's reassuring because Jesus is speaking to his church. He's present with his church, and he is the bridegroom, wants to be with his bride. Don't dwell where Satan dwells. Jesus says, "I know where you live. I know where you are. I want to be present with you. I want to take care of you. I want to love you." And that's what he was saying, not in a condemnatory way to the church at Pergamum, but in a reassuring way. And so what's the challenge for us today? Well, the challenge for us today is to not abandon our love of Jesus as a number did in the church at Pergamum, to not abandon our love for his word, to not abandon our commitment to be faithful in serving him, to not abandon the priority of family worship of a Sunday, to not abandon our love for Christ. Let's not, spiritually speaking, be caught, to borrow the title of the 1991 American thriller. Let's not be caught sleeping with the enemy, but rather let's be faithful to the bridegroom, Jesus. Let's not abandon our commitment to the bridegroom. let's be faithful to him. Be faithful to Jesus.